Hello, my spookies. Happy to see you back. Tonight I want to share a sampling of some of my favorite Edgar Allan Poe stories. After all, his work is what originally set me on a path of seeking all things fearful and fun. So, kick back and relax, whether you've never heard these stories or you just want a trip down memory lane. I have you covered. We'll start with the underrated classic, Manuscript Found in a Bottle, and keep going from there, further into madness, murder, and the macabre. Now let's get started. I think there's a storm forming on the horizon. Manuscript Found in a Bottle by Edgar Allan Poe. Of my country and of my family I have little to say. Ill usage and length of years have driven me from the one and estranged me from the other. Hereditary wealth afforded me an education of no common order, and a contemplative turn of mind enabled me to methodize the stores which early study very diligently garnered up. Beyond all things, the works of the German moralists gave me great delight, not from any ill-advised admiration of their eloquent madness, but from the ease with which my habits of rigid thought enabled me to detect their falsities. I have often been reproached with the aridity of my genius. A deficiency of imagination has been imputed to me as a crime, and the Pyrrhonism of my opinions has at all times rendered me notorious. Indeed, a strong relish for physical philosophy has, I fear, tinctured my mind with a very common error of this age. I mean the habit of referring occurrences, even the least susceptible of such reference, to the principles of that science. Upon the whole, no person could be less liable than myself to be led away from the severe precincts of truth by the ignis fatui of superstition. I have thought proper to premise thus, much lest the incredible tale I have to tell should be considered rather the raving of a crude imagination than the positive experience of a mind to which the reveries of fancy have been a dead letter and a nullity. After many years spent in foreign travel, I sailed in the year 18-something or other from the port of Batavia in the rich and populous island of Java on a voyage to the archipelago of the Sunda Islands. I went as passenger, having no other inducement than a kind of nervous restlessness which haunted me like a fiend. Our vessel was a beautiful ship of about 400 tons, copper-fastened and built at Bombay of Malabar teak. She was freighted with cotton wool and oil from the Lashadive Islands. We had also on board coir, jaggery, ghee, cocoa nuts, and a few cases of opium. The stowage was clumsily done, and the vessel consequently crank. We got under way with a mere breath of wind, and for many days stood along the eastern coast of Java, without any other incident to beguile the monotony of our course than the occasional meeting with some of the small grabs of the archipelago to which we were bound. One evening, leaning over taffrail, I observed a very singular, isolated cloud to the northwest. It was remarkable, as well for its color as from its being the first we had seen since our departure from Batavia. I watched it attentively until sunset, when it spread all at once to the eastward and westward, girding in the horizon with a narrow strip of vapor and looking like a long line of low beach. My notice was soon afterwards attracted by the duskered appearance of the moon and the peculiar character of the sea. The latter was undergoing a rapid change, and the water seemed more than usually transparent, although I could distinctly see the bottom yet. Heaving the lead, I found the ship in 15 fathoms. The air now became intolerably hot and was loaded with spiral exhalations, similar to those arising from heated iron. As night came on, every breath of wind died away, and a more entire calm it is impossible to conceive. The flame of a candle burned upon the poop without the least perceptible motion, and a long hair held between the finger and thumb hung without the possibility of detecting a vibration. However, as the captain said, he could perceive no indication of danger, and as we were drifting in bodily to shore, he ordered the sails to be furled and the anchor let go. No watch was set, and the crew, consisting principally of Malays, stretched themselves deliberately upon deck, not without a full presentiment of evil. Indeed, every appearance warranted me in apprehending a simoom. I told the captain my fears, but he paid no attention to what I said, and left me without deigning to give a reply. My uneasiness, however, prevented me from sleeping, and about midnight I went up upon deck. As I placed my foot upon the upper step of the companion ladder, I was startled with a loud, humming noise, like that occasioned by the rapid revolution of a mill wheel, and before I could ascertain its meaning, I found the ship quivering to its center. In the next instant, a wilderness of foam hurled us upon our beam ends, and, rushing over us fore and aft, swept the entire decks from stem to stern. The extreme fury of the blast proved in a great measure the salvation of the ship. Although completely waterlogged, yet, as all her masts had gone by the board, she rose, after a minute, heavily from the sea and, staggering a while beneath the immense pressure of the tempest, finally righted. By what miracle I escaped destruction, it is impossible to say. Stunned by the shock of the water, I found myself, upon recovery, jammed in between the sternpost and rudder. With great difficulty I gained my feet, and looking dizzily around, was, at first, struck with the idea of our being among breakers, so terrific beyond the wildest imagination was the whirlpool of mountainous and foaming ocean within which we were engulfed. After a while, I heard the voice of an old Swede who had shipped with us at the moment of our leaving port. I hallooed to him with all my strength, and presently he came reeling aft. We soon discovered that we were the sole survivors of the accident. All on deck, with the exception of ourselves, had been swept overboard, and the captain and mates must have perished as they slept, for the cabins were deluged with water. Without assistance, we could expect to do little for the security of the ship, and our exertions were at first paralyzed by the momentary expectation of going down. Our cable had, of course, parted like pack thread at the first breath of the hurricane, or we should have been instantaneously overwhelmed. We scudded with frightful velocity before the sea, and the water made clear breaches over us. The framework of our stern was shattered excessively, and in almost every respect we had received considerable injury. But to our extreme joy, we found the pumps unchoked, and that we had made no great shifting of our ballast. The main fury of the simoom had already blown over, and we apprehended little danger from the violence of the wind. But we looked forward to its total cessation with dismay, well believing that, in our shattered condition, we should inevitably perish in the tremendous swell which would ensue. But this very apprehension seemed by no means likely to be soon verified. For 5 entire days and nights, during which our only subsistence was a small quantity of jaggery, procured with great difficulty from the forecastle, the hulk flew at a rate defying computation, before rapidly succeeding flaws of wind which, without equaling the first violence of the simoom, were still more terrific than any tempest I had before encountered. Our course for the first 4 days was, with trifling variations, southeast and by south, and we must have run down the coast of New Holland. On the 5th day the cold became extreme, although the wind had hauled round a point more to the northward. The sun arose with a sickly yellow luster, and clambered a very few degrees above the horizon, emitting no decisive light. There were no clouds whatever apparent, yet the wind was upon the increase, and blew with a fitful and unsteady fury. About noon, as nearly as we could guess, our attention was again arrested by the appearance of the sun. It gave out no light, properly so called, but a dull and sullen glow, unaccompanied by any ray. Just before sinking within the turgid sea, its central fires suddenly went out, as if hurriedly extinguished by some unaccountable power. It was a dim, silver-like rim alone, as it rushed down the unfathomable ocean. We waited in vain for the arrival of the 6th day. That day, to me, has not yet arrived. To the Swede, never did arrive. Thenceforward, we were enshrouded in pitchy darkness, so that we could not have seen an object at 20 paces from the ship. Eternal night continued to envelop us, all relieved by the phosphoric sea brilliancy to which we had been accustomed in the tropics. We observed, too, that, although the tempest continued to rage with unabated violence, there was no longer to be discovered the usual appearance of surf or foam which had hitherto attended us. All around was horror, and thick gloom, and a black sweltering desert of ebony. Superstitious terror crept by degrees into the spirit of the old Swede, and my own soul was wrapped up in silent wonder. We neglected all care of the ship as worse than useless, and securing ourselves as well as possible to the stump of the mizzenmast, looked out bitterly into the world of ocean. We had no means of calculating time, nor could we form any guess of our situation. We were, however, well aware of having made farther to the southward than any previous navigators, and felt extreme amazement at not meeting with the usual impediments of ice. In the meantime, every moment threatened to be our last. Every mountainous billow hurried to overwhelm us. The swell surpassed anything I had imagined possible, and that we were not instantly buried is a miracle. My companion spoke of the lightness of our cargo and reminded me of the excellent qualities of our ship, but I could not help feeling the utter hopelessness of hope itself, and prepared myself gloomily for that death which I thought nothing could defer beyond an hour as, with every knot of way the ship made, the swelling of the black, stupendous seas became more dismally appalling. At times we gasped for breath at an elevation beyond the albatross, at times became dizzy with the velocity of our descent into some watery hell, where the air grew stagnant and no sound disturbed the slumbers of the kraken. We were at the bottom of one of these abysses when a quick scream from my companion broke fearfully upon the night. "See! See!" cried he, shrieking in my ears. "Almighty God! See! See!" As he spoke, I became aware of a dull, sullen glare of red light which streamed down the sides of the vast chasm where we lay, and threw a fitful brilliancy upon our deck. Casting my eyes upwards, I beheld a spectacle which froze the current of my blood. At a terrific height directly above us, and upon the very verge of the precipitous descent, hovered a gigantic ship of nearly 4,000 tons. Although upreared upon the summit of a wave of more than 100 times her own altitude, her apparent size still exceeded that of any ship of the line or East Indiaman in existence. Her huge hull was a deep, dingy black, unrelieved by any of the customary carvings of a ship. A single row of brass cannon protruded from her open ports, and dashed off from their polished surfaces the fires of innumerable battle lanterns, which swung to and fro about her rigging. But what mainly inspired us with horror and astonishment was that she bore up under a press of sail in the very teeth of that supernatural sea and of that ungovernable hurricane. When we first discovered her, her stupendous bows were alone to be seen, as she rose up, like a demon of the deep, slowly from the dim and horrible gulf beyond her. For a moment of intense terror she paused upon the giddy pinnacle, as if in contemplation of her own sublimity, then trembled and tottered and came down. At this instant, I know not what sudden self-possession came over my spirit. Staggering as far aft as I could, I awaited fearlessly the ruin that was to overwhelm. Our own vessel was at length ceasing from her struggles, and sinking with her head to the sea. The shock of the descending mass struck her, consequently, in that portion of her frame which was already under water, and the inevitable result was to hurl me in the irresistible violence upon the rigging of the stranger. As I fell, the ship hove in stays, and went about, and to the confusion ensuing, I attributed my escape from the notice of the crew. With little difficulty I made my way unperceived to the main hatchway, which was partially open, and soon found an opportunity of secreting myself in the hold. Why I did so, I can hardly tell. A nameless and indefinite sense of awe, which at first sight of the navigators of the ship had taken hold of my mind, was perhaps the principle of my concealment. I was unwilling to trust myself with a race of people who had offered, to the cursory glance I had taken, so many points of vague novelty, doubt, and apprehension. I therefore thought proper to contrive a hiding place in the hold. This I did by removing a small portion of the shifting boards in such a manner as to afford me a convenient retreat between the huge timbers of the ship. I had scarcely completed my work when a footstep in the hold forced me to make use of it. A man passed by my place of concealment with a feeble and unsteady gait. I could not see his face, but had an opportunity of observing his general appearance. There was about it an evidence of great age and infirmity. His knees tottered beneath a load of years, and his entire frame quivered under the burthen. He muttered to himself, in a low, broken tone, some words of a language which I could not understand, and groped in a corner among a pile of singular-looking instruments and decayed charts of navigation. His manner was a wild mixture of the peevishness of second childhood and the solemn dignity of a god. He at length went on deck, and I saw him no more. A feeling for which I have no name has taken possession of my soul, a sensation which will admit of no analysis, to which the lesson of bygone time are inadequate, and for which I fear futurity itself will offer me no key. To a mind constituted like my own, the latter consideration is an evil. I know that I shall never be satisfied with regard to the nature of my conceptions. Yet it is not wonderful that these conceptions are indefinite, since they have their own origin in sources so utterly novel. A new sense, a new entity is added to my soul. It is long since I first trod the deck of this terrible ship, and the rays of my destiny are, I think, gathering to a focus. Incomprehensible men, wrapped up in meditations of a kind which I cannot divine, they pass me by unnoticed. Concealment is utter folly on my part, for the people will not see. It was but just now that I passed directly before the eyes of the mate. It was no long while ago that I ventured into the captain's own private cabin and took thence the materials with which I write and have written. I shall from time to time continue this journal. It is true that I may not find an opportunity of transmitting it to the world, but I will not fail to make the endeavor. At the last moment, I will enclose the message in a bottle and cast it within the sea. An incident has occurred which has given me new room for meditation. Are such things the operations of ungoverned chance? I had ventured upon deck and thrown myself down without attracting any notice among a pile of ratlin stuff and old sails in the bottom of the yawl. While musing upon the singularity of my fate, I unwittingly daubed with a tar brush the edges of a neatly folded studding sail, which lay near me on a barrel. The studding sail is now bent upon the ship, and the thoughtless touches of the brush are spread out into the word Discovery. I have made many observations lately upon the structure of the vessel. Although well armed, she is not, I think, a ship of war. Her rigging, build, and general equipment all negative a supposition of this kind. What she is not, I can easily perceive. What she is, I fear, it is impossible to say. I know not how it is, but in scrutinizing her strange model and singular cast of spars, her huge size and overgrown suits of canvas, her severely simple bow and antiquated stern, There will occasionally flash across my mind a sensation of familiar things, and there is always mixed up with such indistinct shadows of recollection an unaccountable memory of old foreign chronicles and ages long ago. I have been looking at the timbers of the ship. She is built of a material to which I am a stranger. There is a peculiar character about the wood which strikes me as rendering it unfit for the purpose to which it has been applied. I mean its extreme porousness, considered independently of the worm-eaten condition which is consequence of navigation in these seas, and apart from the rottenness attendant upon age. It will appear perhaps an observation somewhat over-curious, but this wood has every characteristic of Spanish oak, if Spanish oak were distended or swelled by any unnatural means. In reading the above sentence, a curious apothegm of an old weather-beaten Dutch navigator comes full upon my recollection. It is as sure, he was wont to say, when any doubt was entertained of his veracity, as sure as there is a sea where the ship itself will grow in bulk like the living body of the seaman. About an hour ago, I made bold to thrust myself among a group of the crew. They paid me no manner of attention, and, although I stood in the very midst of them all, seemed utterly unconscious of my presence. Like the one I had at first seen in the hold, they all bore about them the marks of a hoary old age. Their knees trembled with infirmity. Their shoulders were bent double with decrepitude. Their shriveled skins rattled in the wind. Their voices were low, tremulous, and broken. Their eyes glistened with the rheum of years, and their gray hairs streamed terribly in the tempest. Around them, on every part of the deck, lay scattered mathematical instruments of the most quaint and obsolete construction. I mentioned some time ago the bending of a studding sail. From that period, the ship, being thrown dead off the wind, was held her terrific course due south, with every rag of canvas packed upon her from her trucks to her lower studding sail booms, and rolling every moment her topgallant yardarms into the most appalling hell of water which it can enter into the mind of a man to imagine. I have just left the deck, where I find it impossible to maintain a footing, although the crew seem to experience little inconvenience. It appears to me a miracle of miracles that our enormous bulk is not buried up once and forever. We are surely doomed to hover continually upon the brink of eternity, without taking a final plunge into the abyss. From billows 1,000 times more stupendous than any I have ever seen, we glide away with the facility of the arrowy seagull, and the colossal waters rear their heads above us like demons of the deep, but like demons confined to simple threats and forbidden to destroy. I am led to attribute these frequent escapes to the only natural cause which can account for such effect. I must suppose the ship to be within the influence of some strong current or impetuous undertow. I have seen the captain face to face, and in his own cabin, but, as I expected, he paid me no attention, although in his appearance there is, to a casual observer, nothing which might bespeak him more or less than man. Still, a feeling of irrepressible reverence and awe mingled with the sensation of wonder with which I regarded him. In stature he is nearly my own height, that is, about 5 feet 8 inches. He is of a well-knit and compact frame of body, neither robust nor remarkably otherwise, but it is the singularity of the expression which reigns upon the face. It is the intense, the wonderful, the thrilling evidence of old age so utter, so extreme, which excites within my spirit a sense, a sentiment ineffable. His forehead, although little wrinkled, seemed to bear upon it the stamp of a myriad of years. His gray hairs are records of the past, and his grayer eyes are sibyls of the future. The cabin floor was thickly strewn with strange, iron-clasped folios and mouldering instruments of science, and obsolete, long-forgotten charts. His head was bowed upon his hands, and he pored with a fiery, unquiet eye over a paper which I took to be a commission, and which, at all events, bore the signature of a monarch. He muttered to himself, as did the first seaman whom I saw in the hold, some low, peevish syllables of a foreign tongue. And although the speaker was close at my elbow, yet his voice seemed to reach my ears from the distance of a mile. The ship and all in it are imbued with the spirit of eld. The crew glide to and fro like the ghosts of buried centuries. Their eyes have an eager and uneasy meaning. And when their figures fall athwart my path in the wild glare of the battle lanterns, I feel as I have never felt before, although I have been all my life a dealer in antiquities, and imbibed the shadows of fallen columns at Baalbek and Tadmor and Persepolis, until my very soul has become a ruin. When I look around me, I feel ashamed of my former apprehensions. If I trembled at the blast which hitherto attended us, shall I not stand aghast at a warring of the wind and ocean? To convey any idea of which the words tornado and simoom are trivial and ineffective. All in the immediate vicinity of the ship is the blackness of eternal night and a chaos of foamless water. But about a league on either side of us may be seen, indistinctly and at intervals, stupendous ramparts of ice, towering away into the desolate sky and looking like the walls of the universe. As I imagined, the ship proves to be in a current, if that appellation can properly be given to a tide, which, howling and shrieking by the white ice, thunders on to the southward with a velocity like the headlong dashing of a cataract. To conceive the horror of my sensations is, I presume, utterly impossible, yet a curiosity to penetrate the mysteries of these awful regions predominates even over my despair, and will reconcile me the most hideous aspect of death. It is evident that we are hurrying onwards to some exciting knowledge, some never-to-be-imparted secret, whose attainment is destruction. Perhaps this current leads us to the southern pole itself. It must be confessed that a supposition apparently so wild has every probability in its favor. The crew pace the deck with unquiet and tremulous step, but there is upon their countenances an expression more of the eagerness of hope than of the apathy of despair. In the meantime, the wind is still in our poop, and as we carry a crowd of canvas, the ship is at times lifted bodily from out the sea. Oh, horror upon horror! The ice opens suddenly to the right and to the left, and we are whirling dizzily in immense concentric circles, round and round the borders of a gigantic amphitheater, the summit of whose walls is lost in the darkness and the distance, But little time will be left me to ponder upon my destiny. The circles rapidly grow small. We are plunging madly within the grasp of the whirlpool, and amid a roaring and bellowing and shrieking of ocean and of tempest, the ship is quivering, oh God, and going down. Hop Frog by Edgar Allan Poe. I never knew anyone so keenly alive to a joke as the king was. He seemed to live only for joking. To tell a good story of the joke kind, and to tell it well, was the surest road to his favor. Thus it happened that his 7 ministers were all noted for their accomplishments as jokesters. They all took after the king, too, in being large, corpulent, oily men, as well as imitable jokers. Whether people grow fat by joking, or whether there is something in fat itself which predisposes to a joke, I have never been quite able to determine, but certain it is that a lean joker is a rara avis in terris. About the refinements, or as he called them, the ghost of wit, the king troubled himself very little. He had an especial admiration for breadth in a jest, and would often put up with length for the sake of it. Over niceties wearied him. He would have preferred Rabelais' Gargantua to a Zadig of Voltaire, and upon the whole practical jokes suited his taste far better than verbal ones. At the date of my narrative, professing jesters had not altogether gone out of fashion at court. Several of the great continental powers still retained their fools, who wore motley, with caps and bells, and who were expected to be always ready with sharp witticisms, at a moment's notice, in consideration of the crumbs that fell from the royal table. Our king, as a matter of course, retained his fool. The fact is, he required something in the way of folly, if only to counterbalance the heavy wisdom of the 7 wise men who were his ministers, not to mention himself. His fool, or professional jester, was not only a fool, however. His value was trebled in the eyes of the king by the fact of his being also a dwarf and a cripple. Dwarfs were as common at court in those days as fools, and many monarchs would have found it difficult to get through their days. Days are rather longer at court than elsewhere, without both a jester to laugh with and a dwarf to laugh at. But as I have already observed, your jesters, in 99 cases out of 100, are fat, round, and unwieldy, so that it was no small source of self-gratulation with our king that, in Hop Frog, this was the fool's name, he possessed a triplicate treasure in one person. I believe the name Hop Frog was not that given to the dwarf by his sponsors at baptism, but was conferred upon him by general consent of the several ministers on account of his inability to walk as other men do. In fact, Hop Frog could only get along by a sort of interjectional gait, something between a leap and a wriggle, a movement that afforded illimitable amusement, and of course consolation to the king, for, notwithstanding the protuberance of his stomach and a constitutional swelling of the head, the king, by his whole court, was accounted a capital figure. But although Hop Frog, through the distortion of his legs, could move only with great pain and difficulty along a road or floor, the prodigious muscular power which nature seemed to have bestowed upon his arms, by way of compensation for deficiency in the lower limbs, enabled him to perform many feats of wonderful dexterity. Where trees or ropes were in question, or anything else to climb, at such exercises he certainly much more resembled a squirrel, or a small monkey, than a frog. I am not able to say with precision from what country Hop Frog originally came. It was from some barbarous region, however, that no person had ever heard of, a vast distance from the court of our king. Hopfrog and a young girl very little less dwarfish than himself, although of exquisite proportions and a marvelous dancer, had been forcibly carried off from their respective homes in adjoining provinces and sent as presents to the king by one of his ever-victorious generals. Under these circumstances, it is not to be wondered at that a close intimacy arose between the two little captives. Indeed, they soon became sworn friends. Hopfrog, who, although he made a great deal of sport, was by no means popular, had it not in his power to render Trippetta many services, but she, on account of her grace and exquisite beauty, although a dwarf, was universally admired and petted, so she possessed much influence, and never failed to use it, whenever she could, for the benefit of Hopfrog. On some grand state occasion, I forgot what, the king determined to have a masquerade, and whenever a masquerade or anything of that kind occurred at our court, then the talents of both Hopfrog and Trippetta were sure to be called in to play. Hopfrog in especial was so inventive in the way of getting up pageants, suggesting novel characters and arranging costumes for masked balls, that nothing could be done, it seems, without his assistance. The night appointed for the fete had arrived. A gorgeous hall had been fitted up under Trippetta's eye, with every kind of device which could possibly give eclat to a masquerade. The whole court was in a fever of expectation. As for costumes and characters, it might well be supposed that everybody had come to a decision on such points. Many had made up their minds as to what roles they should assume a week or even a month in advance, and in fact there was not a particle of indecision anywhere, except in the case of the king and his 7 ministers. Why they hesitated I never could tell, unless they did it by way of a joke. More probably they found it difficult, on account of being so fat, to make up their minds. At all events, time flew, and, as a last resort, they sent for Trippetta and Hopfrog. When the 2 little friends obeyed the summons of the king, they found him sitting at his wine with 7 members of his cabinet council, but the monarch appeared to be in a very ill humor. He knew that Hopfrog was not fond of wine, for it excited the poor cripple almost to madness, and madness is no comfortable feeling. But the king loved his practical jokes, and took pleasure in forcing Hopfrog to drink, and, as the king called it, to be merry. "Come here, Hopfrog," said he, as the jester and his friend entered the room. "Swallow this bumper to the health of your absent friends." Here Hopfrog sighed. "And then let us have the benefit of your invention. We want characters, man. Something novel, out of the way. We are wearied with this everlasting sameness. Come, drink! The wine will brighten your wits." Hopfrog endeavored, as usual, to get up a jest in reply to these advances from the king, but the effort was too much. It happened to be the poor dwarf's birthday, and the command to drink to his absent friends forced the tears to his eyes. Many large, bitter drops fell into the goblet as he took it, humbly, from the hand of the tyrant. "Ah ha ha!" roared the latter, as the dwarf reluctantly drained the beaker. "See what a glass of good wine can do! Why, your eyes are shining already!" Poor fellow! His large eyes gleamed rather than shone, for the effect of wine on his excitable brain was not more powerful than instantaneous. He placed the goblet nervously on the table and looked round upon the company with a half-insane stare. They all seemed highly amused at the success of the king's joke. "And now to business," said the Prime Minister, a very fat man. "Yes," said the king. "Come, lend us your assistance. Characters, my fine fellow, we stand in need of characters. All of us, ha ha ha!" and as this was seriously meant for a joke, his laugh was chorused by the 7. Hopfrog also laughed, although feebly and somewhat vacantly. "Come, come," said the king, impatiently. "Have you nothing to suggest?" "I am endeavoring to think of something novel," replied the dwarf abstractedly, for he was quite bewildered by the wine. "Endeavoring!" cried the tyrant fiercely. "What do you mean by that? Ah, I perceive. You are sulky and want more wine. Here, drink this." And he poured out another gobletful and offered it to the cripple, who merely gazed at it, gasping for breath. "Drink, I say!" shouted the monster. "Or by the fiends!" The dwarf hesitated. The king grew purple with rage. The courtiers smirked. Trippetta, pale as a corpse, advanced to the monarch's seat and, falling on her knees before him, implored him to spare her friend. The tyrant regarded her for some moments in evident wonder at her audacity. He seemed quite at a loss what to do or say, how most becomingly to express his indignation. At last, without uttering a syllable, he pushed her violently from him and threw the contents of the brimming goblet in her face. The poor girl got up the best she could and, not daring even to sigh, resumed her position at the foot of the table. There was a dead silence for about half a minute, during which the falling of a leaf or of a feather might have been heard. It was interrupted by a low but harsh and protracted grating sound, which seemed to come at once from every corner of the room. What are you making that noise for?" demanded the king, turning furiously to the dwarf. The latter seemed to have recovered in great measure from his intoxication, and looking fixedly but quietly into the tyrant's face, merely ejaculated, "I? How could it have been me?" "The sound appeared to come from without," observed one of the courtiers. "I fancy it was the parrot at the window, wetting his bill upon his cage wires." "True," replied the monarch, as if much relieved by the suggestion. "But on the honor of a knight, I could have sworn that it was the gritting of this vagabond's teeth." Hereupon the dwarf laughed. The king was too confirmed a joker to object to anyone's laughing, and displayed a set of large, powerful, and very repulsive teeth. Moreover, he avowed his perfect willingness to swallow as much wine as desired. The monarch was pacified, and having drained another bumper with no very perceptible ill effect, Hopfrog entered at once and with spirit into the plans for the masquerade. "I cannot tell what was the association of the idea," observed he, very tranquilly, and as if he had never tasted wine in his life. "But just after your majesty had struck the girl and thrown the wine in her face, just after your majesty had done this, and while the parrot was making that odd noise outside the window, there came into my mind a capital diversion. One of my own country frolics, often enacted among us at our masquerades, but here it will be new altogether. Unfortunately, however, it requires a company of 8 persons, and—" "Here we are!" cried the king, laughing at his acute discovery of the coincidence. "8 to a fraction, I and my 7 ministers. Come, what is the diversion?" "We call it," replied the cripple, "the 8 chained orangutans, and it really is excellent sport if well enacted." "We will enact it," remarked the king, drawing himself up and lowering his eyelids. "The beauty of the game," continued Hopfrog, "lies in the fright it occasions among the women." "Capital!" roared in chorus the monarch and his ministry. "I will equip you as orangutans," proceeded the dwarf. "Leave all that to me. The resemblance shall be so striking that the company of masqueraders will take you for real beasts, and of course, they will be as much terrified as astonished." "Oh, this is exquisite!" exclaimed the king. "Hop Frog, I will make a man of you." The chains are for the purpose of increasing the confusion by their jangling. You are supposed to have escaped en masse from your keepers. Your Majesty cannot conceive the effect produced at a masquerade by 8 chained orangutans, imagined to be real ones by most of the company, and rushing in with savage cries among the crowd of delicately and gorgeously habited men and women. The contrast is inimitable. "It must be," said the king, and the council arose hurriedly, as it was growing late, to put in execution the scheme of Hop Frog. His mode of equipping the party as orangutans was very simple, but effective enough for his purposes. The animals in question had, at the epoch of my story, very rarely been seen in any part of the civilized world, and as the imitations made by the dwarf were sufficiently beast-like, and more than sufficiently hideous, their truthfulness to nature was thus thought to be secured. The king and his ministers were first encased in tight-fitting stockinette shirts and drawers. They were then saturated with tar. At this stage of the process, someone of the party suggested feathers, but the suggestion was at once overruled by the dwarf, who soon convinced the 8 by ocular demonstration that the hair of such a brute as the orangutan was much more efficiently represented by flue. A thick coating of the latter was accordingly plastered upon the coating of tar. A long chain was now procured. First it was passed around the waist of the king and tied, then about another of the party and also tied, then about all successively in the same manner. When this chaining arrangement was complete and the party stood as far apart from each other as possible, they formed a circle, and to make things appear natural, Hop Frog passed the residue of the chain in 2 diameters, at right angles, across the circle, after the fashion adopted at the present day by those who capture chimpanzees or other large apes in Borneo. The grand saloon in which the masquerade was to take place was a circular room, very lofty and receiving the light of the sun only through a single window at top. At night, the season for which the apartment was especially designed, it was illuminated principally by a large chandelier, depending by a chain from the center of the skylight, and lowered or elevated by means of a counterbalance as usual, but, in order not to look unsightly, this latter passed outside the cupola and over the roof. The arrangements of the room had been left to Trippetta's superintendence, but in some particulars, it seems, she had been guided by the calmer judgment of her friend the dwarf. At his suggestion, it was that on this occasion the chandelier was removed. Its waxen drippings, which, in weather so warm it was quite impossible to prevent, would have been seriously detrimental to the rich dresses of the guests, who, on account of the crowded state of the saloon, could not all be expected to keep from out its center, that is to say, from under the chandelier. Additional sconces were set in various parts of the hall. Out of the war, and a flambeau emitting sweet odor was placed in the right hand of each of the caryatids that stood against the wall, some 50 or 60 altogether. The 8 orangutans, taking Hop Frog's advice, waited patiently until midnight, when the room was thoroughly filled with masqueraders, before making their appearance. No sooner had the clock ceased striking, however, than they rushed, or rather rolled in, all together, for the impediments of their chains caused most of the party to fall, and all to stumble as they entered. The excitement among the masqueraders was prodigious, and filled the heart of the king with glee. As had been anticipated, there were not a few of the guests who supposed the ferocious-looking creatures to be beasts of some kind in reality, if not precisely orangutans. Many of the women swooned with affright, and had not the king taken the precaution to exclude all weapons from the saloon, his party might soon have expiated their frolic in their blood. As it was, a general rush was made for the doors, but the king had ordered them to be locked immediately upon his entrance, and at the dwarf's suggestion, the keys had been deposited with him. While the tumult was at its height, and each masquerader attentive only to his own safety, for, in fact, there was much real danger from the pressure of the excited crowd, the chain by which the chandelier ordinarily hung, and which had been drawn up on its removal, might have been seen very gradually to descend, until its hooked extremity came within 3 feet of the floor. Soon after this, the king and his 7 friends, having reeled about the hall in all directions, found themselves at length in its center and, of course, in immediate contact with the chain. While they were thus situated, the dwarf, who had followed noiselessly at their heels, inciting them to keep up the commotion, took hold of their own chain at the intersection of the 2 portions which crossed the circle diametrically and at right angles. Here, with the rapidity of thought, he inserted the hook from which the chandelier had been wont to depend, and in an instant, by some unseen agency, the chandelier chain was drawn so far upward as to take the hook out of reach, and, as an inevitable consequence, to drag the orangutans together in close connection and face to face. The masqueraders by this time had recovered in some measure from their alarm, and, beginning to regard the whole matter as a well-contrived pleasantry, set up a loud shout of laughter at the predicament of the apes. "Leave them to me!" now screamed Hopfrog, his shrill voice making itself easily heard through all the din. "Leave them to me! I fancy I know them. If I can only get a good look at them, I can soon tell who they are." Here, scrambling over the heads of the crowd, he managed to get to the wall, when, seizing a flambeau from one of the caryatids, he returned as he went to the center of the room, leaping, with the agility of a monkey, upon the king's head, and thence clambered a few feet up the chain, holding down the torch to examine the group of orangutans, and still screaming, "I shall soon find out who they are!" And now, while the whole assembly, the apes included, were convulsed with laughter, the jester suddenly uttered a shrill whistle, when the chain flew violently up for about 30 feet, dragging with it the dismayed and struggling orangutans, and leaving them suspended in midair between the skylight and the floor. Hopfrog, clinging to the chain as it rose, still maintained his relative position in respect to the 8 maskers, and still, as if nothing were the matter, continued to thrust his torch toward them, as though endeavoring to discover who they were. So thoroughly astonished was the whole company at this ascent, that a dead silence of about a minute's duration ensued. It was broken by such a low, harsh, grating sound as had before attracted the attention of the king and his counselors when the former threw the wine in the face of Trippetta. But, on the present occasion, there could be no question as to whence the sound issued. It came from the fang-like teeth of the dwarf, who ground them and gnashed them as he foamed at the mouth and glared with an expression of maniacal rage into the upturned countenances of the king and his 7 companions. "Aha!" said at length the infuriated jester. "Aha! I begin to see who these people are now." Here, pretending to scrutinize the king more closely, he held the flambeau to the flaxen coat which enveloped him, and which instantly burst into a sheet of vivid flame. In less than half a minute, the whole 8 orangutans were blazing fiercely amid the shrieks of the multitude who gazed at them from below, horror-stricken and without the power to remember them the slightest assistance. At length the flames, suddenly increasing in virulence, forced the jester to climb higher up the chain to be out of their reach, and as he made this movement, the crowd again sank, for a brief instant, into silence. The dwarf seized his opportunity and once more spoke. "I now see you distinctly," he said. "What manner of people these maskers are! They are a great king and his 7 privy councillors, a king who does not scruple to strike a defenseless girl and his 7 councillors who abet him in the outrage. As for myself, I am simply Hopfrog, the jester, and this is my last jest." Owing to the high combustibility of both the flax and the tar to which it adhered, the dwarf had scarcely made an end of his brief speech before the work of vengeance was complete. The 8 corpses swung in their chains, a fetid, blackened, hideous, and indistinguishable mass. The cripple hurled his torch at them, clambered leisurely to the ceiling, and disappeared through the skylight. It is supposed that Trippetta, stationed on the roof of the saloon, had been the accomplice of her friend in this fiery revenge, and that, together, they effected their escape to their own country, for neither was seen again. Never Bet the Devil Your Head, a tale with a moral, by Edgar Allan Poe. Con tal que las costumbres de un autor, says Don Thomas de las Torres, in the preface to his amatory poems. Siempreras y castas y porto muy poco que no sean inglumente severas sos obras, meaning, in plain English, that, provided the morals of an author are pure, personally, it signifies nothing what are the morals of his books. We presume that Don Thomas is now in purgatory for the assertion. It would be a clever thing, too, in the way of poetical justice, to keep him there until his amatory poems get out of print or are laid definitely upon the shelf through lack of readers. Every fiction should have a moral, and, what is more to the purpose, the critics have discovered that every fiction has. Philip Melanchthon some time ago wrote a commentary upon the Batrachomachia and proved that the poet's object was to excite a distaste for sedition. Pierre Lassine, going a step farther, shows that the intention was to recommend to young men temperance in eating and drinking. Just so, too, Jacobus Hugo has satisfied himself that Eunice, Homer meant to insinuate John Calvin by Antinius, Martin Luther by Latofagi, Protestants in general, and by the Harpies, the Dutch. Our more modern scholastics are equally acute. These fellows demonstrate a hidden meaning in the Antivillians, a parable of the Powhatan, new views in Cock Robin, and transcendentalism in Hop O' My Thumb. In short, it has been shown that no man can sit down to write without a very profound design. Thus, to authors in general, much trouble is spared. A novelist, for example, need have no care of his moral. It is there, that is to say, it is somewhere, and the moral and the critics can take care of themselves. When the proper time arrives, all that the gentleman intended, and all that he did not intend, will be brought to light, in the dial or the downeaster, together with all that he ought to have intended, and the rest that he clearly meant to intend, so that it will all come very straight in the end. There is no just ground, therefore, for the charge brought against me by certain ignoramuses, that I have never written a moral tale, or, in more precise words, a tale with a moral. They are not the critics predestined to bring me out and develop my morals. That is the secret. By and by, the North American Quarterly Humdrum will make them ashamed of their stupidity. in the meantime, by way of saying execution, by way of mitigating the accusations against me, I offer the sad history appended, a history about whose obvious moral there can be no question whatever, since he who runs may read it in the large capitals which form the title of the tale. I should have credit for this arrangement, a far wiser one than that of La Fontaine and others, who reserve the impression to be conveyed until the last moment, and thus sneak it in at the fag end of their fables. In functi injuria, ne officiantur, was a law of the 12 tables, and de mortiis nil nisi bonum is an excellent injunction, even if the dead in question be nothing but dead small beer. It is not my design, therefore, to vituperate my deceased friend Toby Dammit. He was a sad dog, it is true, and a dog's death it was that he died, but he himself was not to blame for his vices. He grew out of a personal defect in his mother. She did her best in the way of flogging him while an infant, for duties to her well-regulated mind were always pleasures, and babies, like tough steaks or the modern Greek olive trees, are invariably the better for beating. But poor woman, she had the misfortune to be left-handed, and a child flogged left-handedly had better be left unflogged. The world revolves from right to left. It will not do to whip a baby from left to right. If each blow in the proper direction drives an evil propensity out, it follows that every thump in an opposite one knocks its quota of wickedness in. I was often present at Toby's chastisements, and even by the way in which he kicked, I could perceive that he was getting worse, and worse every day. At last I saw, through the tears in my eyes, that there was no hope of the villain at all. And one day, when he had been cuffed until he grew so black in the face that one might have mistaken him for a little African, and no effect have been produced beyond that of making him wriggle himself into a fit, I could stand it no longer, but went down upon my knees forthwith, and, uplifting my voice, made prophecy of his ruin. The fact that his precocity in vice was awful. At months of age he used to get into such passions that he was unable to articulate. At 6 months I caught him gnawing a pack of cards. At 7 months he was in the constant habit of catching and kissing the female babies. At 8 months he peremptorily refused to put his signature to the temperance pledge. Thus he went on increasing in iniquity, month after month, until, at the close of the first year, he not only insisted upon wearing mustaches, but had contracted a propensity for cursing and swearing, and for backing his assertions by bets. Through this latter, most ungentlemanly practice, the ruin which I had predicted to Toby Dammit overtook him at last. The fashion had grown with his growth and strengthened with his strength, so that when he came to be a man, he could scarcely utter a sentence without interlarding it with a proposition to gamble. Not that he actually laid wagers. No, I will do my friend the justice to say that he would as soon have laid eggs. With him the thing was a mere formula, nothing more. His expressions on this head had no meaning attached to them whatever. They were simply, if not altogether innocent, expletives, imaginative phrases wherewith to round off a sentence. When he said, "I'll bet you so-and-so," nobody ever thought of taking him up, but still I could not help thinking it my duty to put him down. The habit was an immoral one, and so I told him. It was a vulgar one. This I begged him to believe. I was discountenanced by society. Here I said nothing but the truth. It was forbidden by act of Congress. Here I had not the slightest intention of telling a lie. I remonstrated, but to no purpose. I demonstrated, in vain. I entreated. He smiled. I implored. He laughed. I preached. He sneered. I threatened. He swore. I kicked him. He called for the police. I pulled his nose. He blew it, and offered to bet the devil his head that I would not venture to try that experiment again. Poverty was another vice which the peculiar physical deficiency of Dammit's mother had entailed upon her son. He was detestably poor, and this was the reason, no doubt, that his expletive expressions about betting seldom took a pecuniary turn. I will not be bound to say that I ever heard him make use of such a figure of speech as, "I'll bet you $1." It was usually, "I'll bet you what you please," or "I'll bet you what you dare," or "I'll bet you a trifle," or else, more significantly still, "I'll bet the devil my head." This latter form seemed to please him best, perhaps because it involved the least risk, for Dammit had become excessively parsimonious. Had anyone taken him up, his head was small, and thus his loss would have been small too. But these are my own reflections, and I am by no means sure that I am right in attributing them to him. At all events, the phrase in question grew daily in favor, notwithstanding the gross impropriety of a man betting his brains like banknotes. But this was a point which my friend's perversity of disposition would not permit him to comprehend. In the end, he abandoned all other forms of wager and gave himself up to, "I'll bet the devil my head," with a pertinacity and exclusiveness of devotion that displeased not less than it surprised me. I am always displeased by circumstances for which I cannot account. Mysteries force a man to think and so injure his health. The truth is, there was something in the air with which Mr. Dammit was wont to give utterance to his offensive expression. Something in his manner of enunciation, which at first interested and afterwards made me very uneasy. Something which, for want of a more definite term at present, I must be permitted to call queer, but which Mr. Coleridge would have called mystical, Mr. Kant pantheistical, Mr. Carlyle twistical, and Mr. Emerson hyperquisitistical. I began to not like it at all. Mr. Dammit's soul was in a perilous state. I resolved to bring all my eloquence into play to save it. I vowed to serve him as St. Patrick in the Irish Chronicle is said to have served the toad, that is to say, awaken him to a sense of his situation. I addressed myself to the task forthwith. Once more I betook myself to remonstrance. Again I collected my energies for a final attempt at expostulation. When I had made an end of my lecture, Mr. Dammit indulged himself in some very equivocal behavior. For some moments he remained silent, merely looking at me inquisitively in the face. But presently he threw his head to one side and elevated his eyebrows to a great extent. Then he spread out the palms of his hands and shrugged up his shoulders. Then he winked with the right eye. Then he repeated the operation with the left. Then he shut them both up very tight. Then he opened them both so very wide that I became seriously alarmed for the consequences. Then, applying his thumb to his nose, he thought proper to make an indescribable movement with the rest of his fingers. Finally, setting his arms akimbo, he condescended to reply. I can call to mind only the heads of his discourse. He would be obliged to me if I would hold my tongue. He wished none of my advice. He despised all my insinuations. He was old enough to take care of himself. Did I still think him Baby Dammit? Did I mean to say anything against his character? Did I intend to insult him? Was I a fool? Was my maternal parent aware, in a word, of my absence from the domiciliary residence? He would put this latter question to me as to a man of veracity, and he would bind himself to abide by my reply. Once more he would demand explicitly if my mother knew that I was out. My confusion, he said, betrayed me, and he would be willing to bet the devil his head that she did not. Mr. Dammit did not pause for my rejoinder. Turning upon his heel, he left my presence with undignified precipitation. It was well for him that he did so. My feelings had been wounded. Even my anger had been aroused. For once I would have taken him upon his insulting wager. I would have won for the arch-enemy Mr. Dammit's little head. For the fact is, my mamma was very well aware of my merely temporary absence from home. But coda shefa midehed, heaven gives relief, as the Mussulmen say when you tread upon their toes. It was in pursuance of my duty that I had been insulted, and I bore the insult like a man. It now seemed to me, however, that I had done all that could be required of me, in the case of this miserable individual, and I resolved to trouble him no longer with my counsel, but to leave him to his conscience, and himself. But although I forbore to intrude with my advice, I could not bring myself to give up his society altogether. I even went so far as to humor some of his less reprehensible propensities, and there were times when I found myself lauding his wicked jokes, as epicures do mustard, with tears in my eyes. So profoundly did it grieve me to hear his evil talk. One fine day, having strolled out all together arm in arm, our route led us in the direction of a river. There was a bridge, and we resolved to cross it. It was roofed over, by way of protection from the weather, and the archway, having but few windows, was thus very uncomfortably dark. As we entered the passage, the contrast between the external glare and the interior gloom struck heavily upon my spirits, but so upon those of the unhappy Dammit, who offered to bet the devil his head that I was hipped. He seemed to be in an unusual good humor. He was excessively lively, so much so that I entertained I know not what of uneasy suspicion. It is not impossible that he was affected with the transcendentals. I am not well enough versed, however, in the diagnosis of this disease to speak with decision upon the point, and unhappily there were none of my friends of the dial present. I suggest the idea nevertheless because of a certain species of austere Merry Andrewism, which seemed to beset my poor friend and caused him to make quite a tomfool of himself. Nothing would serve him but wriggling and skipping about under and over everything that came in his way, now shouting out, and now lisping out, all manner of odd little and big words, yet preserving the gravest face in the world all the time. I really could not make up my mind whether to kick or to pity him. At length, having passed nearly across the bridge, we approached the termination of the footway, when our progress was impeded by a turnstile of some height. Through this I made my way quietly, pushing it around as usual. But this turn would not serve the turn of Mr. Dammit. He insisted upon leaping the stile, and said he could cut a pigeon wing over it in the air. Now this, conscientiously speaking, I did not think he could do. The best pigeon winger over all kinds of style was my friend Mr. Carlyle, and as I knew he could not do it, I would not believe that it could be done by Toby Dammit. I therefore told him in so many words that he was a braggadocio, and could not do what he said. For this I had reason to be sorry afterwards, for he straightway offered to bet the devil his head that he could. I was about to reply, notwithstanding my previous resolutions, with some remonstrance against his impiety, when I heard, close at my elbow, a slight cough, which sounded very much like the ejaculation, "Ahem!" I started and looked about me in surprise. My glance at length fell into a nook of the framework of the bridge, and upon the figure of a little lame old gentleman of venerable aspect. Nothing could be more revered than his whole appearance, for he not only had a full suit of black, but his shirt was perfectly clean, and the collar turned very neatly down over a white cravat, while his hair was parted in front like a girl's. His hands were clasped pensively together over his stomach, and his two eyes were carefully rolled up into the top of his head. Upon observing him more closely, I perceived that he wore a black silk apron over his small clothes, and this was a thing which I thought very odd. Before I had time to make any remark, however, upon so singular a circumstance, he interrupted me with a second ahem. To this observation I was not immediately prepared to reply. The fact is, remarks of this laconic nature are nearly unanswerable. I have known a quarterly review nonplussed by the word fudge. I am not ashamed to say, therefore, that I turned to Mr. Dammit for assistance. "Dammit," said I, "what are you about? Don't you hear? The gentleman says, ahem." I looked sternly at my friend while I thus addressed him, for to say the truth, I felt particularly puzzled, and when a man is particularly puzzled he must knit his brows and look savage, or else he is pretty sure to look like a fool. "Damn it," observed I, although this sounded very much like an oath, than which nothing was farther from my thoughts. "Damn it," I suggested, "the gentleman says ahem." I do not attempt to defend my remark on the score of profundity. I did not think it profound myself, but I have noticed that the effect of our speeches is not always proportionate with their importance in our own eyes. And if I had shot Mr. D through and through with a Paxian bomb, or knocked him in the head with the Poets and Poetry of America, he could hardly have been more discomfited than when I addressed him with those simple words. "Damn it, what are you about? Don't you hear? The gentleman says ahem." "You don't say," gasped he at length, after turning more colors than a pirate runs up, one after the other when chased by a man of war. "Are you quite sure he said that? Well, at all events I am in for it now, and may as well put a bold face upon the matter. Here goes, then. Ahem." At this, the little old gentleman seemed pleased. God only knows why. He left his station at the nook of the bridge, limped forward with a gracious air, took Dammit by the hand, and shook it cordially, looking all the while straight up in his face with an air of the most unadulterated benignity, which it is possible for the mind of a man to imagine. "I am quite sure you will win it, Dammit," said he with the frankest of all smiles. "But we are obligated to have a trial, you know, for the sake of mere form." "Ahem," replied my friend, taking his coat with a deep sigh, tying a pocket handkerchief around his waist, and producing an unaccountable alteration in his countenance, by twisting up his eyes and bringing down the corners of his mouth. "Ahem, and ahem," said he again, after a pause, and not another word more than ahem did I ever know him to say after that. "Aha," thought I, without expressing myself aloud. "This is quite a remarkable silence on the part of Toby Dammit, and is no doubt a consequence of his verbosity upon a previous occasion. One extreme induces another. I wonder if he's forgotten the many unanswerable questions which he propounded to me so fluently on the day when I gave him my last lecture. At all events, he is cured of the transcendentals." "Ahem," here replied Toby, just as if he had been reading my thoughts, and looking like a very old sheep in a reverie. The old gentleman now took him by the arm and led him more into the shade of the bridge, a few paces back from the turnstile. "My good fellow," said he, "I make it a point of conscience to allow you this much run. Wait here till I take my place by the stile, so that I may see whether you go over it handsomely and transcendentally, and don't omit any flourishes of the pigeon wing. A mere form, you know. I will say 1, 2, 3, and away. Mind you start at the word away." Here he took his position by the stile, paused a moment as if in profound reflection, then looked up, and, I thought, smiled very slightly, then tightened the strings of his apron, then took a long look at Dammit, and finally gave the word as agreed upon. 1, 2, 3, and away. Punctually at the word away, my poor friend set off in a strong gallop. The stile was not very high like Mr. Lord's, nor yet very low like the Mr. Lord's reviewers, but upon the whole I made sure that he would clear it. And then, what if he did not? Ah, that was the question. What if he did not? What right, said I, had the old gentleman to make any other gentleman jump? The little old dot and carry one. Who is he? If he asks me to jump, I won't do it. That's flat, and I don't care who the devil is. The bridge, as I say, was arched and covered in a very ridiculous manner, and there was a most uncomfortable echo about it at all times, an echo which I never before so particularly observed as when I uttered the last 4 words of my remark. But what I said, or what I thought, or what I heard, occupied only an instant. In less than 5 seconds from his starting, my poor Toby had taken the leap. I saw him run nimbly, and spring grandly from the floor of the bridge, cutting the most awful flourishes with his legs as he went up. I saw him high in the air, pigeon-winging it to admiration just over the top of the stile. And of course I thought it an unusually singular thing that he did not continue to go over, but the whole leap was the affair of a moment, and before I had a chance to make any profound reflections, down came Mr. Dammit, on the flat of his back, on the same side of the stile, from which he had started. At the same instant, I saw the old gentleman limping off at the top of his speed, having caught and wrapped up in his apron something that fell heavily into it from the darkness of the arch just over the turnstile. At all this I was much astonished, but I had no leisure to think, for Mr. Dammit lay particularly still, and I concluded that his feelings had been hurt and that he stood in need of my assistance. I hurried up to him and found that he had received what might be termed a serious injury. The truth is, he had been deprived of his head, which, after close search, I could not find anywhere. So I determined to take him home and send for the homeopathicists. In the meantime, a thought struck me, and I threw open an adjacent window of the bridge, when the sad truth flashed upon me at once. About 5 feet just above the top of the turnstile, and crossing the arch of the footpath so as to constitute a brace, there extended a flat iron bar, lying with its breadth horizontally, and forming one of a series that served to strengthen the structure throughout its extent. With the edge of this brace it appeared evident that the neck of my unfortunate friend had come precisely in contact. He did not long survive his terrible loss. The homeopathists did not give him little enough physic, and what little they did give him, he hesitated to take. So in the end, he grew worse, and at length died. A lesson to all riotous livers. I bedewed his grave with my tears, worked a bar sinister on his family's escutcheon, and, for the general expenses of his funeral, sent in my very moderate bill to the transcendentalists. The scoundrels refused to pay it, so I had Mr. Dammit dug up at once and sold him for dog's meat. The Murders in the Rue Morgue by Edgar Allan Poe. Part 1. Paris. In Paris it was, in the summer of 1840. There I first met that strange and interesting young fellow, Auguste Dupin. Dupin was the last member of a well-known family, a family which had once been rich and famous. He himself, however, was far from rich. He cared little about money. He had enough to buy the most necessary things of life, and a few books. He did not trouble himself about the rest. Just books. With books, he was happy. We first met when we were both trying to find the same book, as it was a book which few had ever heard of. This chance brought us together in an old bookstore. Later we met again in the same store, then again in another bookstore. Soon we began to talk. I was deeply interested in the family history he told me. I was surprised at how much and how widely he had read. More important, the force of his busy mind was like a bright light in my soul. I felt that the friendship of such a man would be for me riches without price. I, therefore, told him of my feelings toward him, and he agreed to come and live with me. He would have, I thought, the joy of using my many fine books, and I would have the pleasure of having someone with me, for I was not happy alone. We passed the days reading, writing, and talking. But Dupin was a lover of the night, and at night, often with only the light of the stars to show us the way, we walked the streets of Paris, sometimes talking, sometimes quiet, always thinking. I soon noticed a special reasoning power he had, an unusual reasoning power. Using it gave him great pleasure. He told me once, with a soft and quiet laugh, that most men have windows over their hearts. Through these he could see into their souls. Then he surprised me by telling what he knew about my own soul, and I found that he knew things about me that I had thought only I could possibly know. His manner at these moments was cold and distant. His eyes looked empty and far away, and his voice became high and nervous. At such times it seemed to me that I saw not just Dupin, but two Dupins. One who coldly put things together, and another who just as coldly took them apart. One night we were walking down one of Paris's long and dirty streets. Both of us were busy with our thoughts. Neither had spoken for perhaps 15 minutes. It seemed as if we had each forgotten that the other was there, at his side. I soon learned that Dupin had not forgotten me, however. Suddenly, he said, "You're right. He is a very little fellow, that's true, and he would be more successful if he acted in lighter, less serious plays." "Yes, there can be no doubt of that," I said. At first I saw nothing strange in this. Dupin had agreed with me, with my own thoughts. This, of course, seemed to be quite natural. For a few seconds I continued walking and thinking. But suddenly I realized that Dupin had agreed with something which was only a thought. I had not spoken a single word. I stopped walking and turned to my friend. "Dupin," I said. "Dupin, this is beyond my understanding. How could you know what I was thinking of?" Here I stopped in order to test him, to learn if he really did know my unspoken thoughts. "How did I know you were thinking of Chantilly?" "Why do you stop? You were thinking that Chantilly is too small for the plays in which he acts." "That is indeed what I was thinking, but tell me, in heaven's name, the method, if method there is, by which you have been able to see into my soul in this manner." "It was the fruit seller." "Fruit seller? I know no fruit seller." "I mean the man who ran into you as we entered this street. It may have been 10 or 15 minutes ago, perhaps less." Yes, that's true. I remember now. A fruit seller carrying a large basket of apples on his head almost threw me down. But I don't understand why the fruit seller should make me think of Chantilly, or, if he did, how you can know that. I will explain. Listen closely now. Let us follow your thoughts from the fruit seller to the play actor Chantilly. Those thoughts must have gone like this: from the fruit seller to the cobblestones, from the cobblestones to the stereotomy, and from the stereotomy to the Epicurus, to Orion, and then to Chantilly. As we turned into this street, the fruit seller, walking very quickly past us, ran against you and made you step up on some cobblestones which had not been put down evenly. And I could see that the stones had hurt your foot. You spoke a few angry words to yourself and continued walking. But you kept looking down at the cobblestones in the street, so I knew you were still thinking of stones. Then we came to a small street where they are putting down street stones, which they have cut in a new and very special way. Here your face became brighter, and I saw your lips move. I could not doubt that you were saying the word stereotomy, the name of this new way of cutting stones. It is a strange word, isn't it? But you will remember that we read about it in the newspaper only yesterday. I thought that word stereotomy must make you think of that old Greek writer named Epicurus, who wrote of something he called atoms. He believed that the world and everything in the heavens above are made of these atoms. Not long ago, you and I were talking about Epicurus and his ideas, his atoms, ideas which Epicurus wrote about more than 2,000 years ago. We were talking about how much those old ideas are like today's ideas about the earth and the stars and the sky. I felt sure that you would look up to the sky. You did look up. Now I was certain that I had been following your thoughts as they had, in fact, come into your mind. I too looked up and saw that the group of stars we call Orion is very bright and clear tonight. I knew you would notice this and think about the name Orion. Now, follow my thoughts carefully. Only yesterday in the newspaper, there was an article about the actor Chantilly, an article which was not friendly to Chantilly, not friendly at all. We noticed that the writer of the article had used some words taken from a book we both had read. These words were about Orion, so I knew you would put together the two ideas of Orion and Chantilly. I saw you smile, remembering that article and the hard words in it. Then I saw you stand straighter, as tall as you could make yourself. I was sure you were thinking of Chantilly's size, and especially his height. He is small, he is short, and so I spoke, saying that he is indeed a very little fellow, this Chantilly, and he would be more successful if he acted in lighter, less serious plays. I will not say that I was surprised. I was more than surprised. I was astonished. Dupin was right as he could be. Those were, in fact, my thoughts, my unspoken thoughts as my mind moved from one thought to the next. But if I was astonished by this, I would soon be more than astonished. One morning, this strangely interesting man showed me once again his unusual reasoning power. We heard that an old woman had been killed by unknown persons. The killer, or the killers, had cut her head off and escaped into the night. Who was this killer? This murderer? The police had no answer. They had looked everywhere and found nothing that helped them. They did not know what to do next, and so they did nothing. But not Dupin. He knew what to do. Part 2. It was in Paris in the summer of 1840 that I met Auguste Dupin. He was an unusually interesting young man with a busy, forceful mind. This mind could, it seemed, look right through a man's body, into his soul, and uncover his deepest thoughts. Sometimes he seemed to be not one, but two people. One who could coldly put things together, and another who just as coldly took them apart. One morning in the heat of the summer, Dupin showed me once again his special reasoning power. We read in the newspaper about a terrible killing. An old woman and her daughter, living alone in an old house in the Rue Morgue, had been killed in the middle of the night. Paris, July 7, 1840. In the early morning today, the people in the western part of the city were awakened from their sleep by cries of terror, which came, it seemed, from a house in the street called the Rue Morgue. The only persons living in the house were an old woman, Mrs. L'Espagne, and her daughter. Several neighbors and a policeman ran toward the house, but by the time they reached it, the cries had stopped. When no one answered their calls, they forced the door open. As they rushed in, they heard voices, two voices. They seemed to come from above. The group hurried from room to room, but they found nothing until they reached the 4th floor. There they found a door that was firmly closed, locked, with the key inside. Quickly they forced the door open, and they saw spread before them a bloody, sickening scene. A scene of horror. The room was in the wildest possible order. Broken chairs and tables were lying all around the room. There was only one bed, and from it everything had been taken and thrown into the middle of the floor. There was blood everywhere, on the floor, on the bed, on the walls. A sharp knife covered with blood was lying on the floor. In front of the fireplace, there was some long gray hair, also bloody. It seemed to have been pulled from a human head. On the floor were 4 pieces of gold, an earring, several objects made of silver, and 2 bags containing a large amount of money in gold. Clothes had been thrown around the room. A box was found under the bed covers. It was open and held only a few old letters and papers. There was no one there, or so it seemed. Above the fireplace they found the dead body of the daughter. It had been put up into the opening where the smoke escapes to the sky. The body was still warm. There was blood on the face and on the neck. There were dark, deep marks which seemed to have been made by strong fingers. These marks surely show how the daughter was killed. After hunting in every part of the house without finding anything more, the group went outside. Behind the building they found the body of the old woman. Her neck was almost cut through, and when they tried to lift her up, her head fell off. The next day, the newspaper offered to its readers these new facts. The murders in the Rue Morgue, Paris, July 8, 1840. The police have talked with many people about the terrible killings in the old house on the Rue Morgue, but nothing has been learned to answer the question of who the killers were. Pauline Dubourg, a washwoman, says she has known both of the dead women for more than 3 years and has washed their clothes during that period. The old lady and her daughter seemed to love each other dearly. They always paid her well. She did not know where their money came from, she said. She never met anyone in the house. Only the 2 women lived on the 4th floor. Pierre Moreau, a shopkeeper, says Mrs. L'Espagne had bought food at his shop for nearly 4 years. She owned the house and had lived in it for more than 6 years. People said they had money. He never saw anyone enter the door except the old lady and her daughter, and a doctor 8 or 10 times, perhaps. Many other persons, neighbors, said the same thing. Almost no one ever went into the house, and Mrs. L'Espagne and her daughter were not often seen. Jules Minaud, a banker, says that Mrs. L'Espagne had put money in his bank, beginning 8 years before. 3 days before her death, she took out of the bank a large amount of money in gold. A man from the bank carried it for her to her house. Isidore Mousset, a policeman, says that he was with the group that first entered the house. While he was going up the stairs, he heard 2 voices, one low and soft, and one hard, high, and very strange. The voice of someone who was certainly not French. The voice of a foreigner, Spanish perhaps. It was not a woman's voice. He could not understand what it said, but the low voice, the softer voice, said in French, "My God." Alfonso Garcia, who is Spanish and lives on the Rue Morgue, says he entered the house but did not go up the stairs. He is nervous, and he was afraid he might be ill. He heard the voices. He believes the high voice was not that of a Frenchman. Perhaps it was English, but he doesn't understand English, so he is not sure. William Bird, another foreigner, an Englishman, says he was one of the persons who entered the house. He has lived in Paris for 2 years. He heard the voices. The low voice was that of a Frenchman. He was sure, because he heard it say, in French, "My God." The high voice was very loud. He is sure it was not the voice of an Englishman, nor the voice of a Frenchman. It seemed to be that of an Italian. It might have been a woman's voice. He does not understand Italian. Mr. Alberto Montani, an Italian, was passing the house at the time of the cries. He says that they lasted for about 2 minutes. They were screams, long and loud, terrible, fearful sounds. Montani, who speaks Spanish but not French, says that he also heard 2 voices. He thought both voices were French, but he could not understand any of the words spoken. The persons who first entered the house all agree that the door of the room where the daughter's body was found was locked on the inside. When they reached the door, everything was quiet. When they forced the door open, they saw no one. The windows were closed and firmly locked on the inside. There are no steps that someone could have gone down while they were going up. They say that the openings over the fireplace are too small for anyone to have escaped through them. It took 4 or 5 people to pull the daughter's body out of the opening over the fireplace. A careful search was made through the whole house. It was 4 or 5 minutes from the time they heard the voices to the moment they forced open the door of the room. Paul Dumas, a doctor, says that he was called to see the bodies soon after they were found. They were in horrible condition, badly marked and broken. Such results could not have come from a woman's hands, only from those of a very powerful man. A daughter had been killed by strong hands around her neck. The police have learned nothing more than this. A killing as strange as this has never before happened in Paris. Police do not know where to begin to look for the answer. When we had finished reading the newspaper's account of the murders, neither Dupin nor myself said anything for a while. But I could see in his eyes that cold, empty look, which told me that his mind was working busily. When he asked me what I thought of all of this, I could only agree with all of Paris. I told him I considered it a very difficult problem, a mystery to which it was not possible to find an answer. No, said Dupin. No, I think you're wrong. A mystery it is, yes, but there must be an answer. Let us go to the house and see what we can see. There must be an answer. There must! Part 3. It was in Paris that I met Auguste Dupin. He was an unusually interesting young man with a busy, forceful mind. This mind could, it seemed, look right through a man's body into his deepest soul. One hot summer morning, we read in the newspapers about a terrible killing. The dead persons were an old woman and her unmarried daughter, who lived alone on the 4th floor of an old house on the street called the Rue Morgue. Someone had taken the daughter's neck in his powerful fingers and pressed his fearful strength until her life was gone. Her mother's body was found outside, behind the house, with the head nearly cut off. The knife with which she was killed was found, however, in the room on the floor. Several neighbors ran to the house when they heard the women's cries of fear. As they ran up to the 4th floor, they heard 2 other voices, but when they reached the room and broke down the door, they found no living person in the room. Like the door, the 2 windows were firmly closed, locked on the inside. There was no other way that the killer could have got in or out of the room. The Paris police did not know where to begin to look for the answer. I told Dupin that it seemed to me that it was not possible to learn the answer to the mystery of these killings. No, said Dupin. No, I think you are wrong. A mystery it is, yes, but there must be an answer. We must not judge what is possible just by what we have read in the newspapers. The Paris police work hard and often get good results, but there is no real method in what they do. When something more than simple hard work is needed, when a little real method is needed, the police fail. Sometimes they stand too near the problem. Often, if a person looks at something very closely, he can see a few things more clearly, but the shape of the whole thing escapes him. There must be an answer. There must! Let us go to the house and see what we can see. I know the head of the police, and he will allow us to do so, and this will be interesting and give us some pleasure. I thought it strange that Dupin should believe we would get pleasure out of this, but I said nothing. It was late in the afternoon when we reached the house on the Rue Morgue. It was easily found, for there were still many persons, in fact, a crowd, standing there looking at it. Before going in, we walked all around it, and Dupin carefully looked at the neighboring houses as well as this one. I could not understand the reason for such great care. We came again to the front of the house and went in. We went up the stairs into the room where the daughter's body had been found. Both bodies were there. The police had left the room as they had found it. I saw nothing beyond what the newspaper had told us. Dupin looked with great care at everything. At the bodies, at the walls, the fireplace, the windows. Then we went home. Dupin said nothing. I could see the cold look in his eyes which told me that his mind was working busily, quickly. I asked no questions. Dupin said nothing until the next morning, when he came into my room and asked me suddenly if I had not noticed something especially strange about what we saw at the house on the Rue Morgue. I replied, "Nothing more than we both read in the newspaper." "Tell me, my friend, how shall we explain the horrible force, the unusual strength used in these murders? And whose were the voices that were heard? No one was found except the dead women, yet there was no way for anyone to escape. And the wild condition of the room, the body which was found head down above the fireplace, the terrible broken appearance of the body of the old lady, when its head cut off. These are all so far from what might be expected that the police are standing still. They don't know where to begin. These things are unusual indeed, but they are not deep mysteries. We should not ask what has happened, but what has happened that has never happened before. In fact, the very things that the police think cannot possibly be explained are the things which will lead me to the answer. Indeed, I believe they have already led me to the answer." I was so surprised I could not say a word. Dupin looked quickly at the door. "I am now waiting for a person who will know something about these murders, these wild killings. I do not think he did them himself, but I think he will know the killer. I hope I am right about this. If I am, then I expect to find the whole answer today. I expect the man here in this room at any moment. It is true that he may not come, but he probably will." "But who is this person? How did you find him?" "I'll tell you. While we wait for this man we do not know, for I have never met him, while we wait, I will tell you how my thoughts went." Dupin began to talk, but it did not seem that he was trying to explain to me what he had thought. It seemed that he was talking to himself. He looked not at me, but at the wall. "It has been fully proved that the voices heard by the neighbors were not the voices of the women who were killed. Someone else was in the room. It is therefore certain that the old woman did not first kill her daughter, then kill herself. She would not have been strong enough to put her daughter's body where it was found, and the manner of the old lady's death shows that she could not have caused it herself. A person can kill himself with a knife, yes, but he surely cannot cut his own head almost off, then drop the knife on the floor and jump out the window. It was murder, then, done by some third person or persons, and the voices heard were the voices of these persons. Let us now think carefully about the things people said about those voices. Did you notice anything especially strange in what was told about them?" "Well, yes. Everybody agreed that the low voice was the voice of a Frenchman, but they could not agree about the high voice." "Ah, and that was what they said, yes, but that was not what was so strange about what they said. You say you have noticed nothing that makes their stories very different from what might have been expected. Yet there was something. All these persons, as you say, agreed about the low voice, but not about the high, hard voice. The strange thing here is that when an Italian, an Englishman, a Spaniard, and a Frenchman tried to tell what the voice was like, each one said it sounded like the voice of a foreigner. How strangely unusual that voice really must have been. Here are 4 men from 4 big countries, and not one of them could understand what the voice said. Each one gave it a different name. Now, I know that there are other countries in the world, You will say that perhaps it was the voice of someone from one of those other lands. Russia, perhaps. But remember, not one of these people heard anything that sounded like a separate word. Here Dupin turned and looked into my eyes. This is what we have learned from the newspaper. I don't know what I have led you to think, but I believe that in this much of the story there are enough facts to lead us in the one and only direction to the right answer. What this answer is, I will not say. Not yet. But I want you to keep in mind that this much was enough to tell me what I must look for when we were in that house on the Rue Morgue. And I found it. Part 4. Murderers had come to the old house on the street called the Rue Morgue. Murderers had come and gone and left behind dead bodies of an old woman and her daughter. The daughter's body was in the bedroom on the 4th floor. The old woman was lying outside, behind the house, her head almost cut off. But the knife which killed her was up in the bedroom, on the floor. The door and the windows were all firmly closed, locked on the inside. There was no way for anyone to go in or out. Voices had been heard. One voice was speaking in French. The other voice had not spoken even one word that anyone could understand. But there was no one in the room when the police arrived. This much we had learned from the newspapers, my friend Dupin and I. Interested by it, we had gone to look at the house and the bodies. Dupin was now explaining to me what he had learned there. That is what we learned from the newspapers. Please remember it, for that much was enough to tell me what I must look for when we were in that house on the Rue Morgue. And I found it. Let us now take ourselves again, in our thoughts, to the room where the murders were done. What shall we first look for? The way the murderers escaped. All right, we agree. I am sure that we do not have to look for anything outside of nature, for anything not having a real form, a body. The killers were not spirits. They were real. They could not go through walls. Then, how did they escape? There's only one way to reason on that subject, and it must lead us to the answer. Let us look, one at a time, at the possible ways to escape. It is clear that the killers were in the room where the daughter was found. From this room they must have escaped. How? At first, I saw no way out. It had been necessary for the neighbors to break down the door in order to enter the room. There was no other door. The opening above the fireplace is not big enough, near the top, for even a small animal. The murderers, therefore, must have escaped through one of the windows. This may not seem possible. We must prove that it is possible. There are 2 main windows in the room. Both of them, you will remember, are made of 2 parts. To open the window, one must lift up the bottom half. One of these windows is easily seen. The lower part of the other is out of sight behind the big bed. I looked carefully at the first of these windows. It was firmly closed, fastened, like the door on the inside. To keep the window closed, to fasten it, someone had to put a strong iron nail into the wood at the side of the window in such a way that the window could not be raised. At least it seemed that the nail held the window closed. The nail was easy to see. There it was, and the people who discovered the killings used their great strength and could not raise the window. I, too, tried to raise the window and could not. I went to the second window and looked behind the bed at the lower half of the window. There was a nail here, too, which held the window closed. Without moving the bed, I tried to open this window also, and again, I could not do so. I did not stop looking for an answer, however, because I knew that what did not seem possible must be proved to be possible. The killers, or perhaps I should say the killer, for I am certain there was only one, the killer escaped through one of these windows. Of this I felt certain. After the murderer had left the bedroom, he could have closed the window from the outside, but he could not have fastened it again on the inside. yet anyone could see the nails which held the windows tightly closed. This was the fact that stopped the police. How could the murderer put the nail back in its place? Perhaps if you pulled out the nail. Yes, that is just what I thought. Two things seemed clear. First, there had to be something wrong with the idea that the nails were holding the windows closed. I didn't know what was wrong. Something was. Second, if it was not the nails which were holding the windows closed, then something else was holding them closed. Something hard to see. Something hidden. I went back to the first window. With great effort, I pulled out the nail. Then I again tried to raise the window. It was still firmly closed. This did not surprise me. There had been a hidden lock, I thought, inside the window. I felt the window carefully with my fingers. Indeed, I found a button which, when I pressed it, opened an inner lock. With almost no effort, I raised the window. Now I knew that the killer could close the window from outside and the window would lock itself. But there was still the nail. Carefully, I put the nail back into the hole from which I had taken it. Then I pressed the button and tried to raise the window. I could not. The nail also was holding the window closed. Then the murderer could not possibly have gone out the window. He could not have gone out that window. Therefore, he must have escaped through the other window. The other window was also held closed by a nail. But I knew I must be right. Although no one else had looked carefully at the window behind the bed, I went to it and tried to see whether the two windows were in some way different. The nail in the second window looked the same as the one I had just seen. I moved the bed so that I could look closely. Yes, there was a button here too. I was so sure I was right that without touching the nail, I pressed the button and tried to raise the window. Up it went. As the window went up, it carried with it the top part of the nail, the head. When I closed the window, the head of the nail was again in its place. It looked just as it had looked before. I took the head of the nail in my fingers, and it easily came away from the window. I saw that the nail had been broken, but when I put the nail head back in its place, the nail again looked whole. What seemed to be not possible, we have proved to be possible. The murderer indeed escaped through that window. I could now see in my mind what had happened. It was a hot summer night. When the murderer first arrived, he found that window open to let some fresh night air come in. Through the open window, the murderer went in and came out again. As he came out, he closed the window, perhaps with a purpose to do so, perhaps by chance. The special lock inside the window held the window firmly closed. The nail only seemed to be holding it closed. And that which was possible looked not possible. Dupin had been talking not to me, it seemed, but to himself. His cold eyes seemed to see only what was in his own mind. Now he stopped and looked straight at me. His eyes were now hard and bright, and I understood that using his unusual reasoning power to find the answer to those bloody murders was giving Dupin great pleasure. At first I could think only of this. Then I said, "Dupin, the windows are on the 4th floor, far above the ground. Even an open window. Yes, that is an interesting question. How did the murderer go from the window down to the ground? Once I was quite certain that the murderer had in fact gone through that window. The rest was not so hard to know. And the answer to this question told me still more about who the murderer was. When you and I first came to the house on the Rue Morgue, we walked around the house. At that time, I noted a long, thin metal pole, which went from the top of the building to the ground. A lightning rod. Put there to carry down to the ground a charge of electricity that might come out of the clouds during a bad summer storm. Here, I thought, is a way for someone to go up or down the wall and then go in or out the window. He would have to be very strong. Although certain animals could easily go up the pole, not every man could do it. Only a man with very special strength and special training. This told me more about what the murderer was like. But I still had the question, who? Part 5. That unusual Frenchman, Auguste Dupin, was still explaining to me how he found the answer to the question of who murdered the 2 women in the house on the Rue Morgue. We now knew that it was indeed possible for the killer to go in and again out of one of the windows, and still leave them both firmly closed, locked on the inside. And I agreed with Dupin when he said that only someone with very special strength and training could have gone up the lightning rod on the side of the house and thus entered the window. But who the murderer was, we still did not know. "Let us look again," said Dupin. "At that room on the 4th floor. Let us now go back in our minds to the room we saw yesterday. Consider its appearance. Clothes had been thrown around the room, yet it seemed that none had been taken. The old woman and her daughter almost never left the house. They had little use for many of the clothes. Those that were found in the room were as good as any they had. If the killer took some, why didn't he take the best, or take all? And why would he take a few clothes and leave all the money? Nearly the whole amount brought from the bank was found, in bags, on the floor. I want you, therefore, to forget the idea in the minds of the police, the idea that a desire for money was what they call the motive, the reason for the murders. This idea rose in their minds when they heard how the money was brought to the house 3 days before the killings. But this is only what we call a coincidence. 2 things happening at the same time, but only by chance and not because of some cause that brought them together. Coincidences happen to all of us every day of our lives. If the gold was the reason for the murders, the killer must have been quite a fool to forget and leave it there. No, I don't think the desire for money was the reason for the killings. I think that there was no reason for these killings, except, perhaps, fear. Now let us look at the murders themselves. A girl is killed by powerful hands around her neck. Then the body is placed in the opening over the fireplace, head down. No murders we usually hear about are like this. There's something here that does not fit our ideas of human actions. Even when we think of men of the most terrible kind, think also of the great strength which was necessary to put the body where it was found. The strength of several men was needed to pull it down. There are other signs of this fearful strength. In front of the fireplace, some gray human hair was lying, thick pieces of it, pulled from the head of the old woman. You saw the hair on the floor yourself, and you saw the blood and skin with it. You know, and I know, that great force is necessary to pull out even 20 or 30 hairs at a time. A much greater force was needed to pull out hundreds of hairs at one time. Also, the head of the old lady was cut almost completely from the body. Why? To kill a woman with a knife, it is not necessary to cut her head off. If now, added to all these things, we added also the condition of the room, we have put together the following ideas: strength more than human, wildness less than human, a murder without reason, a horror beyond human understanding, and a voice which made no sound that men could understand. What result, then, have you come to? What have I helped you to see?" A cold feeling went up and down my back as Dupin asked me the question. A man. Someone who has lost his mind," I said. "A madman? A madman? Only a madman could have done these murders." "I think not. In some ways your idea is a good one, but madmen are from one country or another. Their cries may be terrible, but they are made of words, and some of the words can be understood. Here, look at this hair." I took it from the fingers of the old woman. "The hair of a madman is not like this. Tell me what you think it is." "Dupin, this hair is not human." "I did not say that it is, but before we decide this matter, look at the picture I had made here on this piece of paper. It is a picture of the marks on the daughter's neck. The doctors said these marks were made by fingers. Let me spread the paper on the table before us. Try to put your fingers all at the same time on the picture so that your hand and its fingers will fit the picture of the marks on the daughter's neck." "I cannot." "No, but perhaps we are not doing this in the right way. The paper is spread out on the table. The human neck is round. Here is a piece of wood about as big as the daughter's neck. Put the paper around it and try again. Go on, try." I tried to put my fingers around the piece of wood, as if it were the girl's neck, but still my hand was not large enough to equal the marks left by the killer. "Dupin, these marks were made by no human hand." "No, they were not. I am almost certain that they were made by the hand of an orangutan, one of those man-like animals that live in the wild forests. The great size, the strength, the wildness of these animals are well known. Now, look in this book by Cuvier. Read. Look at the picture." I did so, and at once I knew that Dupin was right in everything he said. The color of the hair, the size of the hand, the terrible strength, the wildness of the killings, those sounds which were a voice, but were not words. Everything fit nicely in its place. "No, not everything. Dupin," I said, "there were two voices. Whose was the second voice?" "The second voice! Yes! Remember, we decided that only someone with a very special kind of strength could have gone up the lightning rod, up the side of the house to the window on the 4th floor. Perhaps an animal, perhaps a strong man from a circus, perhaps a sailor. We know now that one of the voices was the voice of an animal, an orangutan. The other was the voice of a man. This voice spoke only 2 words. They were, 'My God,' spoken in French. Upon those 2 words I have placed my hopes of finding a full answer to this horrible question. The words were an expression of horror. This means that a Frenchman knew about these murders. It is possible, indeed it is probable, that the Frenchman himself did not help the orangutan to kill. Perhaps the animal escaped from him, and he followed it to the house on the Rue Morgue. He could not have caught it again. It must still be free somewhere in Paris. I will not continue with these guesses, for I cannot call them more than that. If I am right, and if the Frenchman did not himself help with the killings, I expect him to come here. Read this. I paid to have this put in the newspaper." I took the newspaper and read the following. "Caught. Early in the morning of the 7th of this month, a very large orangutan. The owner, who is known to be a sailor, may have the animal again if he can prove it is his." "But Dupin, how can you know that the man is a sailor?" "I do not know it. I am not sure of it. I think the man is a sailor. A sailor could go up that pole on the side of the house. Sailors travel to strange, faraway places where such things as orangutans can be got. If I am right, think for a moment. the sailor will say to himself, "The animal is valuable. Why shouldn't I go and get it? The police do not know the animal killed 2 women, and clearly somebody knows I am in Paris. If I do not go get the animal, they will ask why. I don't want anyone to start asking questions about the animal, so I will go and get the orangutan and keep it where no one will see it, until this trouble has passed." This, I believe, is how the sailor will think. But listen! I hear a man's step on the stairs. Dupin had left the front door of the house open, and the visitor entered without using the bell. He came several steps up the stairs, then stopped. We heard him go down again. Dupin was moving toward the door when we heard the stranger coming up. He did not turn back a second time, but came straight to the door of our room. In a strong, warm, friendly voice, Dupin said, "Come in, my friend, come in." Slowly, the door opened, and in came a sailor. Part 6. My friend Dupin was now certain that the murders in the Rue Morgue had been done by a wild animal of the jungle, the man-like animal known as an orangutan. The animal had escaped from its owner, he thought, and the owner was probably a sailor. He had put a notice in the newspaper that the man who owned the orangutan could have it again if he came to our house to get it. Now, as the owner came to our door, we were both wondering if that man would, as Dupin guessed, be a sailor. Yes, the man who entered was indeed a sailor. He was a large man and strong. He carried a big, heavy piece of wood, but no gun. He said to us in French, "Good evening." "Sit down, my friend. I suppose you've come to ask about the orangutan. A very fine animal. I have no doubt that it is a very valuable animal. How old do you think it may be?" "I have no way of guessing how old it is, but it can't be more than 4 or 5 years old. Have you got it here?" No, we have no place for it here. You can get it in the morning. Of course you can prove it's yours." Yes, I can." "I wish I could keep it." "I would like to have it. I will pay you for finding and keeping the animal. Anything within reason." "Well, that is very fair indeed. Let me think. What shall I ask for?" "I know. Let this be my pay. Tell me everything you know about the murders in the Rue Morgue." As quietly as he had spoken, Dupin walked to the door, locked it, and put the key in his coat. At the same time, he took a gun out of his coat and placed it on the table. The sailor's face had become red. He jumped to his feet and reached for his stick of wood, but in the next moment, he fell back into his chair, trembling. His face became quite white, bloodless. He spoke not a word. His eyes were closed. "My friend, you must not be afraid. We are not going to hurt you. I know very well that you yourself are not the killer, but it is true that you know something about him, or about it. From what I have already said, you must know that I have ways of learning about the matter, ways you could never have dreamed of. Now, I know that you yourself have done nothing wrong. You didn't even take any of the money. You have no reason to be afraid to talk and to tell the truth. It is a matter of honor for you to tell all you know, and you know who the killer is. So help me God, I'll tell you all I know about this, all I know, but I don't expect you to believe 1/2 of what I say. Not 1/2. Still, I didn't kill anyone. and I'll tell the whole story if I die for it. It was that animal, the orangutan. About a year ago, our ship sailed to the Far East, to the island of Borneo. I had never before seen Borneo. The forest, the jungle, was thick with trees and other plants, and hot and wet and dark. But we went, a friend and I. We went into that forest for pleasure. There we saw this orangutan, a big animal. But we were two, and we caught it. We took it with us on the ship. Soon, however, my friend died, and the animal was mine. But it was very strong and caused a lot of trouble. In the end, I brought it back to Paris with me. I kept it in my house, in my own house, carefully locked up, so the neighbors could not know about it. The animal had cut one foot badly while on the ship. I thought that as soon as it got well, I would sell it. I was certain that it was of great value, and it was so much trouble to keep. I wanted to sell it soon. The night of the murders, very late, I came home and found the animal in my bedroom. It had got free. I don't know how. It held a knife in its hands and was playing with it. I was afraid. I didn't know what to do. When it saw me, it jumped up, ran out of the room and down the stairs. There it found an open window and jumped into the street. I followed, never far behind, although I had no hope of catching it again. The animal, with the knife still in its hand, stopped often to look back at me. But before I could come near enough to even try to catch it, the animal always started to run again. It seemed to be playing with me. It was nearly morning, but the streets were still dark and quiet. We passed the back of a house in the Rue Morgue. The animal looked up and saw a light in the open window of a room high above. It was the only lighted window in sight. The animal saw the metal pole, went up it easily and quickly, and jumped into the room. All this didn't take a minute. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what I could do. I followed the animal. I too went up the pole. As I am a sailor, that was easy for me, but the open window was far from the pole and I was afraid to try to jump. I could see into the room, however, through the other window which was closed. The two women were sitting there with their backs to the windows. Who can guess why they were not sleeping at that hour of night? A box was in the middle of the floor. The papers which had been in the box were laying around on the floor. The women seemed to be studying some of these. They did not see the animal, which was just standing there, watching, the knife still in one hand. But the old woman heard it and turned her head and saw the animal there, knife in hand, and then I heard the first of those terrible cries. When the animal heard the old woman cry, it caught her by the hair and slowly moved the knife before her face. The daughter, filled with terror, fell to the floor and remained there without moving. Her eyes closed. The old woman continued to cry for help, screaming with fear. I think the animal now was as afraid as the old woman was. With terrible force, it pulled out a handful of hair, and when the woman, covered with blood, tried to run from it, the animal caught her again by the hair, and with one move of its arm, it nearly cut her head from her body. Throwing down the body, the animal turned and saw that the daughter was moving, watching it with horror. With fire in its eyes, it rushed to the girl, put its powerful fingers around her neck, and pressed them firmly until she died. When the girl stopped moving, the animal dropped her body to the floor and looked up. It saw my face in the window. It began to run around the room quickly, without purpose. It jumped up and down, breaking the chairs, pulling the bed to pieces. Suddenly it stopped and took the body of the daughter and, as if to hide it, with terrible strength it put the body up above the fireplace, where it was found. It threw the old woman out the window. All this time I was hanging from the pole, filled with horror. It seemed I had lost the power to move. But when I saw the animal coming toward the window with the old woman's body, my horror became fear. I went quickly down. I almost fell down the pole and I ran. I didn't look back. I ran. Oh my God. My God! The chief of the police was not happy that the answer to the mystery of the killings had been found by someone who was not a policeman. He said that people should keep to their own business. "Let him talk," said Dupin. "Let him talk. He'll feel better for it. And he's a good fellow, but he makes things less simple than they really are. Still, people call him skillful and even wise. I think they say this because of the way he explains carefully, fully, something which is not here or there or anywhere and says, 'Not possible,' about something which is there, before his eyes." The Man That Was Used Up. A Tale of the Late Bugaboo and Kickaboo Campaign by Edgar Allan Poe. Paris, Paris meilleur, et vendez-vous en eux. La morte de ma vie a mis la rotel au tombeau. Corneille. I cannot just now remember when or where I first made the acquaintance of that truly fine-looking fellow, Brevet Brigadier General John A.B.C. Smith. Someone did introduce me to the gentleman. I am sure at some public meeting, I know very well, held about something of great importance, no doubt, at some place or other, I feel convinced, whose name I have unaccountably forgotten. The truth is that the introduction was attended upon my part with a degree of anxious embarrassment, which operated to prevent any definite impressions of either time or space. I am constitutionally nervous. This, with me, is a family failing, and I can't help it. In especial, the slightest appearance of mystery, of any point I cannot exactly comprehend, puts me at once into a pitiable state of agitation. There was something, as it were, remarkable, yes, remarkable, although this is but a feeble term to express my full meaning, about the entire individuality of the personage in question. He was, perhaps, 6 feet in height, and of a presence singularly commanding. There was an air distingué pervading the whole man, which spoke of high breeding, and hinted at high birth. Upon this topic, the topic of Smith's personal appearance, I have a kind of melancholy satisfaction in being minute. His head of hair would have done honor to a Brutus. Nothing could be more richly flowing, or possess a brighter gloss. It was of a jetty black, which was also the color, or, more properly, the no color, of his unimaginable whiskers. You perceive I cannot speak of these latter without enthusiasm. It is not too much to say that they were the handsomest pair of whiskers under the sun. At all events, they encircled, and at times partially overshadowed, a mouth utterly unequaled. Here were the most entirely even and most brilliantly white of all conceivable teeth. From between them, upon every proper occasion, issued a voice of surpassing clearness, melody, and strength. In the matter of eyes, also my acquaintance was preeminently endowed. Either one of such a pair was worth a couple of the ordinary ocular organs. They were of a deep hazel, exceedingly large and lustrous, and there was perceptible about them, ever and anon, just that amount of interesting obliquity which gives pregnancy to expression. The bust of the general was unquestionably the finest bust I ever saw, for your life could not have found a fault with its wonderful proportion. This rare peculiarity set off to great advantage a pair of shoulders, which would have called up a blush of conscious inferiority into the countenance of the marble Apollo. I have a passion for fine shoulders, and may say that I never beheld them in perfection before. The arms altogether were admirably modeled, nor the lower limbs less superb. These were, indeed, the ne plus ultra of good legs. Every connoisseur in such matters admitted the legs to be good. There was neither too much flesh nor too little, neither rudeness nor fragility. I could not imagine a more graceful curve than that of the os femoris, and there was just that due gentle prominence in the rear of the fibula, which goes to the conformation of a properly proportioned calf. I wish to God my young and talented friend Chiponcipino, the sculptor, had seen the legs of Brevet Brigadier General John A.B.C. Smith. But although men so absolutely fine-looking are neither as plenty as raisins or blackberries, still I could not bring myself to believe that the remarkable something to which I alluded just now, that the odd air of je ne sais quoi which hung about my new acquaintance lay altogether, or indeed at all, in the supreme excellence of his bodily endowments. Perhaps it might be traced to the manner, yet here again I could not pretend to be positive. There was a primness, not to say stiffness, in his carriage, a degree of measured and, if I may so express it, of rectangular precision attending his every movement, which, observed in a more diminutive figure, would have had the least little savor in the world of affectation, pomposity, or constraint, but which, noticed in a gentleman of his undoubted dimensions, was readily placed to the account of reserve, hauteur, of a commendable sense, in short, of what is due to the dignity of colossal proportion. The kind of friend who presented me to General Smith whispered in my ear some few words of comment upon the man. He was a remarkable man, a very remarkable man, indeed one of the most remarkable men of the age. He was an especial favorite, too, with the ladies, chiefly on account of his high reputation for courage. In that point he is unrivaled. Indeed, he is a perfect desperado, a downright fire-eater, and no mistake, said my friend, here dropping his voice excessively low and thrilling me with the mystery of his tone. A downright fire-eater, and no mistake, showed that, I should say, to some purpose in the late tremendous swamp fight away down south with the Bugaboo and Kickaboo Indians. Here my friend opened his eyes to some extent. Bless my soul, blood and thunder and all that. Prodigies of valor. Heard of him, of course. You know he's the man. Man alive, how do you do? Why, how are ye? Very glad to see ye indeed. Here interrupted the general himself, seizing my companion by the hand as he drew near and bowing stiffly, but profoundly, as I was presented. I then thought, and I think so still, that I never heard a clearer, nor a stronger voice, nor beheld a finer set of teeth. But I must say that I was sorry for the interruption just at that moment, as owing to the whispers and insinuations aforesaid, my interest had been greatly excited in the hero of the Bugaboo and Kickaboo campaign. However, the delightfully luminous conversation of Brevet Brigadier General John A.B.C. Smith soon completely dissipated this chagrin. My friend leaving us immediately, we had quite a long tete-a-tete. and I was not only pleased but really instructed. I never heard a more fluent talker or a man of greater general information. With becoming modesty, he forbore, nevertheless, to touch upon the theme I had just then most at heart. I mean the mysterious circumstances attending the Bugaboo War, and, on my own part, what I conceived to be a proper sense of delicacy forbade me to broach the subject, although, in truth, I was exceedingly tempted to do so. I perceived, too, that the gallant soldier preferred topics of philosophical interest, and that he delighted especially in commenting upon the rapid march of mechanical invention. Indeed, lead him where I would, this was a point to which he invariably came back. "There's nothing at all like it," he would say. "We are a wonderful people and live in a wonderful age. Parachutes and railroads man-traps and spring guns. Our steamboats are upon every sea, and the Nassau balloon packet is about to run regular trips. Fare either way, only £20 sterling between London and Timbuktu. And who shall calculate the immense influence upon social life, upon arts, upon commerce, upon literature, which will be the immediate result of the great principles of electromagnetics? Nor is this all, let me assure you. There is really no end to the march of invention, the most wonderful, the most ingenious, and let me add, Mr. Thompson, I believe is your name. Let me add, I say, the most useful, the most truly useful mechanical contrivances are daily springing up, like mushrooms, if I may so express myself, or more figuratively, like grasshoppers, Mr. Thompson, about us and, around us. Thompson, to be sure, is not my name, but it is needless to say that I left General Smith with a heightened interest in the man, with an exalted opinion of his conversational powers and a deep sense of the valuable privileges we enjoy in living in this age of mechanical invention. My curiosity, however, had not been altogether satisfied, and I resolved to prosecute immediate inquiry among my acquaintances touching the Brevet Brigadier General himself, and particularly respecting the tremendous events quorum par magna fuit during the Bugaboo and Kickaboo campaign. The first opportunity which presented itself, and which, horresco referens, I did not in the least scruple to seize, occurred at the church of the Reverend Dr. Drummondump, where I found myself established one Sunday, just at sermon time, not only in the pew, but by the side of that worthy and communicative little friend of mine, Ms. Tabitha T. Thus, seated. I congratulated myself, and with much reason, upon the very flattering state of affairs. If any person knew anything about Brevet Brigadier General John A.B.C. Smith, that person, it was clear to me, was Miss Tabitha T. We telegraphed a few signals, and then commenced, sotto voce, a brisk tete-a-tete. "Smith," said she in reply to my very earnest inquiry, "Smith, why not General John A.B.C.? Bless me, I thought you knew all about him. This is a wonderfully inventive age. Horrid affair, that. A bloody set of wretches, those Kickapoos. Fought like a hero. Prodigies of valor. Immortal renown. Smith, Brevet Brigadier General John A.B.C. Why, you know, he's the man." "Man?" Here broke in Dr. Drummondump, at the top of his voice, and with a thump that came near knocking the pulpit about our ears. "Man that is born of a woman hath but a short time to live, but he cometh up and is cut down like a flower." I started to the extremity of the pew, and perceived by the animated looks of the divine that the wrath which had nearly proved fatal to the pulpit had been excited by the whispers of the lady and myself. There was no help for it, so I submitted with a good grace and listened, in all the martyrdom of dignified silence, to the balance of that very capital discourse. Don't go away. Weekly Spooky will be right back. Next evening found me a somewhat late visitor at the Rantipole Theater, where I felt sure of satisfying my curiosity at once by merely stepping into the box of those exquisite specimens of affability and omniscience, the Misses Arabella and Miranda Cognoscenti. That fine tragedian, Climax, was doing Lago to a very crowded house, and I experienced some little difficulty in making my wishes understood, especially as our box was next to the slips and completely overlooked the stage. "Smith," said Miss Arabella, as she had comprehended the purport of my query. "Smith? Why not General John A.B.C.? "Smith?" inquired Miranda musingly. "God bless me, did you ever behold a finer figure?" "Never, madam. But do tell me, or so imitable grace." "Never, upon my word. But pray inform me, or so just an appreciation of stage effect." "Madam, or a more delicate sense of the true beauties of Shakespeare. Be so good as to look at that leg." "The devil!" And I turned again to her sister. "Smith," she said, "why not General John A.B.C.? Horrid affair that, wasn't it? Great wretches, those bugaboo, savage and so on. But we live in a wonderfully inventive age, Smith. Oh, yes! Great man, perfect desperado, immortal renown, prodigies of valor, never heard." This was given in a scream. "Bless my soul, why, he's the man! Mandragora!" "Nor all the drowsy syrups of the world shall ever medicine thee to that sweet sleep, which thou oust yesterday." Here roared our Climax just in my ear, and shaking his fist in my face all the time in a way that I couldn't stand. And I wouldn't. I left the Misses Cognoscenti immediately, went behind the scenes forthwith, and gave the beggarly scoundrel such a thrashing as I trust he will remember till the day of his death. At the soiree of the lovely widow Mrs. Kathleen O'Trump, I was confident that I should meet with no similar disappointment. Accordingly, I was no sooner seated at the card table with my pretty hostess for vis-a-vis than I propounded those questions, the solution of which had become a matter so essential to my peace. "Smith," said my partner. "Why, not General John A.B.C.? Horrid affair that, wasn't it? Diamonds, did you say? Terrible wretches, those kickapoos. We are playing whist, if you please. Mr. Tattle, however, this is the age of invention. Most certainly the age, one may say, the age par excellence. Speak French? Oh, quite a hero, perfect desperado. No hearts, Mr. Tattle? I don't believe it. Immortal renown and all that. Prodigies of valor. Never heard. Why, bless me, he's the man... Man? Captain Man? Here screamed some little feminine interloper from the farthest corner of the room. Are you talking about Captain Man and the duel? Oh, I must hear. Do tell. Go on, Mrs. O'Trump. Do now go on. And go on Mrs. O'Trump did. All about a certain Captain Man, who was either shot or hung, or should have been both shot and hung. Yes, Mrs. O'Trump, she went on, and I went off. There was no chance of hearing anything farther that evening in regard to Brevet Brigadier General John A.B.C. Smith. Still, I consoled myself with the reflection that the tide of ill luck would not run against me forever, and so determined to make a bold push for information at the rout of that bewitching little angel, the graceful Mrs. Pirouette. "Smith," said Mrs. P., as we twirled about together in a pas des affaires. "Smith, Why, not General John ABC. Dreadful business that of the bugaboos, wasn't it? Dreadful creatures, those Indians. Do turn out your toes. I really am ashamed of you. Man of great courage, poor fellow. But this is a wonderful age of invention. Oh, dear me. I'm out of breath. Quite a desperado. Prodigies of valor never heard. Can't believe it. I shall have to sit down and enlighten you, Smith. Why, he's the man. Manfred, I tell you. Here bawled out Miss Basbleu, as I led Mrs. Pirouette to a seat. Did ever anybody hear the like? It's Manfred, I say, and not at all by any means Manfride. Here Miss Basbleu beckoned to me in a very peremptory manner, and I was obliged. Will I nil I to leave Mrs. P for the purpose of deciding a dispute touching the title of a certain poetical drama of Lord Byron's? Although I pronounced, with great promptness, that the true title was Manfride, and not by any means Manfred, yet when I returned to seek Mrs. Pirouette, she was not to be discovered, and I made my retreat from the house in a very bitter spirit of animosity against the whole race of the Basbleus. Matters had now assumed a really serious aspect, and I resolved to call at once upon my particular friend, Mr. Theodore Cinevate, for I knew that here at least I should get something like definite information. "Smith," said he, in his well-known peculiar way of drawling out his syllables. "Smith? Why, not General John ABC. Savage affair that with the Kickapoos, wasn't it? Say, don't you think so? Perfect desperado. Great pity, 'pon my honor. Wonderfully inventive age. Prodigies of valor. By the by, did you ever hear about Captain Mann?" "Captain Mann, he did," said I. "Please to go on with your story." Oh well, quite la même chose, as we say in France. Smith, eh? Brigadier General John ABC, I say. Here Mr. S. thought proper to put his finger to the side of his nose. I say, you don't mean to insinuate now, really and truly, and conscientiously, that you don't know all about that affair of Smith's, as well as I do, eh, Smith? John ABC? Why, bless me, he's the man. Mr. Cinevate, said I imploringly. Is he the man in the mask? No, said he, looking wise, nor the man in the moon. This reply I considered a pointed and positive insult, and so left the house at once in high dudgeon, with a firm resolve to call my friend Mr. Cinevate to a speedy account for his ungentlemanly conduct and ill-breeding. In the meantime, however, I had no notion of being thwarted touching the information I desired. There was one resource left me yet. I would go to the fountainhead. I would call forthwith upon the general himself and demand, in explicit terms, a solution of this abominable piece of mystery. Here, at least, there should be no chance for equivocation. I would be plain, positive, peremptory, as short as pie crust, as concise as Tacitus or Montesquieu. It was early when I called, and the general was dressing, but I pleaded urgent business and was shown at once into his bedroom by an old Negro valet, who remained in attendance during my visit. As I entered the chamber, I looked about, of course, for the occupant, but did not immediately perceive him. There was a large and exceedingly odd-looking bundle of something which lay close by my feet on the floor, and, as I was not in the best humor in the world, I gave it a kick out of the way. "Ahem! Ahem! Rather civil that, I should say," said the bundle, in one of the smallest, and altogether the funniest little voices, between a squeak and a whistle, that I ever heard in all the days of my existence. Ahem! Rather civil that I should observe. I fairly shouted with terror and made off at a tangent into the farthest extremity of the room. God bless me, my dear fellow. Here again whistled the bundle. Why, what is the matter? I really believe you don't know me at all. What could I say to all this? What could I? I staggered into an armchair and, with staring eyes and open mouth, awaited the solution of the wonder. Strange you shouldn't know me, though, isn't it? Presently re-squeaked the nondescript, which I now perceived was performing upon the floor some inexplicable evolution, very analogous to the drawing on of a stocking. There was only a single leg, however, apparent. Strange you shouldn't know me, though, isn't it? Pompey, bring me that leg. Here Pompey handed the bundle a very capital cork leg, already dressed, which it screwed on in a trice, and then it stood upright before my eyes. And a bloody action it was, continued the thing, as if in soliloquy. But then one mustn't fight with the bugaboos and kickapoos, and think of coming off with a mere scratch. Pompey, I'll thank you now for that arm. Thomas, turning to me, is decidedly the best hand at a cork leg, but if you should ever want an arm, my dear fellow, you must really let me recommend you to Bishop. Here Pompey screwed on an arm. We had rather hot work of it, that you may say. Now, you dog, slip on my shoulders and bosom. Pettit makes the best shoulders, but for a bosom, you'll have to go to Ducrow. Bosom? Said I. Pompey, will you never be ready with that wig? Scalping is a rough process after all, but then you can procure such a capital scratch at de Leorme's. Scratch? Now, you nigger, my teeth, for a good set of these you had better go to Parmley's at once. High prices, but excellent work. I swallowed some very capital articles, though, and when the big bugaboo rammed me down with the butt end of his rifle... Butt end? Rammed down? My eye? Oh, yes, by the way, my eye. Here, Pompey, you scamp, screw it in. Those kickapoos are not so very slow at a gouge. But he's a belied man, that Dr. Williams, after all. You can't imagine how well I see with the eyes of his make. I now began very clearly to perceive that the object before me was nothing more nor less than my new acquaintance, Brevet Brigadier General John A.B.C. Smith. The manipulations of Pompey had made, I must confess, a very striking difference in the appearance of the personal man. The voice, however, still puzzled me no little. But even this apparent mystery was speedily cleared up. Pompey, you black rascal, squeaked the general. I really do believe you would let me go out without my pallet. Hereupon, the Negro, grumbling out an apology, went up to his master, opened his mouth with the knowing air of a horse jockey, and adjusted therein a somewhat singular-looking machine in a very dexterous manner that I could not altogether comprehend. The alliteration, however, in the entire expression of the general's countenance was instantaneous and surprising. Then he again spoke. His voice had resumed all that rich melody and strength which I had noticed upon our original introduction. "Din the vagabonds," said he, in so clear a tone that I positively started at the change. "Din the vagabonds, they not only knocked in the roof of my mouth, but took the trouble to cut off at least 7/8 of my tongue. There isn't Bonfanti's equal, however, in America for really good articles of this description. I can recommend you to him with confidence." Here the general bowed, "and assure you that I have the greatest pleasure in doing so." I acknowledged his kindness in my best manner, and took leave of him at once, with a perfect understanding of the true state of affairs, with a full comprehension of the mystery which had troubled me so long, It was evident. It was a clear case. Brevet Brigadier General John A.B.C. Smith was the man that was used up.